a web forum featuring a presentation on current and ongoing work throughout the cooperative. It takes place every third Thursday of the month at 10 o'clock a.m. and serves as a great chance for folks to ask questions and provide input that will help guide your cooperative's direction going forward. So each web forum has the same overall agenda. First, I'll introduce our presenter, who will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And following the presentation, the floor is open to ask any questions about the presentation. We'll spend the rest of the time on updates from your cooperative, followed by an open discussion where anyone can ask questions about what we're up to here in the South Atlantic. So before I hand things off to Rua, a few logistics. It sounds like most of you are already on mute, but I am going to mute everyone during the presentation. So if you have any questions, you can either type them directly into the chat box, which I'll be monitoring, or you can hold them until after the presentation. So if you do use the chat box and want everyone to be able to read the question during the open discussion, just remember to send the note to everyone. And if you want to speak at any time during the discussion session, all you need to do is press *6 on your phone to unmute yourself. So before I mute everybody, does anyone want to chime in with a question or comment?
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, great. So just a reminder of who's on your South Atlantic LCC staff. I think we're missing Ken and Brad today, but everybody else is on the line. Presenting today is Rua Mordecai, your Cooperative Science Coordinator, and he'll be explaining how Blueprint 2.0 will address the threat of sea level rise. So I'm going to pass presenter power over to you to get us started, Rua.
All right, I got my mute off, so I'm ready to go. Hello, everybody. So we had an interesting little twist for this particular talk today on sea level rise. An exciting twist, but an interesting twist. So Brad Pickens, who is our postdoc that was originally going to be giving this presentation, his wife actually had a baby just, I think it was yesterday. So we're very excited for him. He's very busy now and probably not going to have very much sleep left in him. So we're going to be I'm going to be giving the talk here. So apologies for any in advance for any quick visuals or things that may be out of order. We're moving on pretty quickly to try to put these different pieces together. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about incorporating sea level rise into Blueprint 2.0, and I'm just going to share my, one second, working to share my desktop here. Excellent. Okay. So of course we always start with the mission of your cooperative, and today, since we're talking about the updates to Blueprint 2.0, it's very fitting to be focusing on this core direction. So we already have version 1. We're now going to be focusing on the update to version 2.0. As you can see, here's the area of the blueprint's going to be covering for version 2.0. And we're going to be talking about 3 things. First off, we'll talk a little more detail about using the indicators themselves. I know at least a few of the folks on the phone, you've been involved in some of the revision teams, some of the discussions about indicators. We'll also be talking about then depicting sea level rise impacts, sort of model scenarios, and then talk a little bit about incorporating the blueprint strategies. We'll be talking about workshops coming up early next year and how those might interact with sea level rise scenarios. So these are, basically still, various discussions going on, and some details and things may change, but want to get your thoughts early on a lot of these things. Okay, so before we go into the specifics of the sea level rise in Blueprint 2, just wanted to remind everyone about the goals for this update to Blueprint 2.0. So these came from the review of from all of you in the web community and people that have been working with Blueprint 1, and also from the steering committee. And the 3 goals was, first, to be more explicitly connected to the indicators. And so that's why we've been working on finishing, testing, revising, and modeling all of the indicators this year. So we're still on track to have the sort of final approved everything done by mid-January um, for all the different ecosystems. And updating the blueprint using a more data-driven approach. We leverage a lot of the existing plans and a lot of the expert knowledge here. We'll still be using some expert knowledge and strategy in the next version, but folks wanted to bring in more of a sort of a data-driven engine into this. And then finally, a finer resolution. So if you remember, Blueprint 1 was at the sub-watershed Huck 12 level, and folks wanted to try to find a sweet spot for going down just a little bit finer, especially on the terrestrial systems. So those are the 3 tasks for version 2. Now, using the indicators. I just wanted to remind you this general framework. Here's an example from the Estuarine system that we have a series of different indicators from the ecosystems of the South Atlantic, and they're combined supposed to be our representation of the integrity of the system. And so for pretty much every system, there's, in the case of estuaries, there's the ecosystem-specific indicators that you see at the bottom, and then often there's a habitat aggregate or a system aggregate that also combines. So waterscapes, this is the connection between the fresh water all the way out to the marine ecosystem. So for the integrity of the estuarine, as one example, you have those 5 indicators that go to define the integrity. So this is what we've been talking about. So we've got these different indicators, as I mentioned, so obviously more than 2 different systems, but as an example. So we need to be able to pull those things together to get that ecosystem integrity and come up with some kind of priority. And the first step is within the ecosystem. So within each ecosystem, within your sort of maritime forest, your estuarine, your marine, your upland hardwoods, doing the prioritization first within the ecosystem, looking at connections across that same ecosystem type. So to do that and some of the other things we're going to talk about today, we're going to be using a program called Zonation. So it's been around for quite a while now, been used in a whole bunch of different applications, marine planning, terrestrial freshwater planning, climate resilience. So it's pretty flexible and is used to working across multiple systems and in all kinds of different types of ecosystems. And one of the strengths over some of the other things like MarkSan and others is that the algorithm, particularly the one we're using, is pretty easy to understand. And it's really important for people to be able to sort of say, okay, well, why did that place get picked versus that place? And why is that so high integrity? So trying to make sure it's very, very clear in this next version and transparent for those things. So algorithm is relatively easy to deal with. And I'll show you an example of generally how that works here. So this is an early example we've done. You probably heard this a few times now from some of the 3 landscape indicators. And so what it does is it starts with everything included and then basically pulls out the cells that result in the least possible indicator loss. So you have a bunch of indicator layers. This was simple. It had 3. And then you start throwing them out. So in this case, the highest, just using those 3 indicators from the landscapes. So don't pay super attention to the patterns. The dark reds are in the top 20%. The blues are in the lower 20%. So it's basically, it says, okay, well, these sections of downtown Atlanta are the absolute worst. So let's start by throwing those out. And then it works its way out. And then also particularly important is that you can then look at the impact of each of these every single one of the indicators as you sort of move to just the higher and higher priority areas. So as you start throwing out those cells, you can see the trade-offs and how that hits each of the indicators. So this example we used before, these are the climate resilient biodiversity hotspots, came out of TNC resilience analysis, one of the landscape indicators. This is pretty simple, so you have to remove a lot of the landscape since we only have 3 indicators to have a big hit on those. But what you're seeing if you move from left to right on that graph, you're basically moving from everything, including all the blues, to only the red areas. So that's what you're sort of moving. And so on the moving from left to right, you're pulling out more and more of the landscape, and then the y-axis is showing how many of those climate resilient hotspots are left at the end. So how many would you if you just picked those red areas? So that's basically how it works. It's really not too crazily complicated. There's more technical details. I'd be glad to answer questions about that. So that's the basic idea of how we're going to be doing it both within and across systems as well. So this is a simple example from the beaches. I just pulled this up real quick. It's a little hard to see because we just don't worry about the details. We want to just give you some sort of visual here. But one thing, and this is going to be important later, that you may or may not be able to see from here is we're in Cumberland Island, so we're at that Georgia-Florida border here. And some of these particularly darker areas of higher integrity beaches alongside of Cumberland Island. So just remember that versus some lighter areas farther south down on Amelia. So that's within the ecosystem. So for each of the ecosystems, based on their extent, we'll have a priority ranking that pulls together the different indicators. And they're all weighted equally. So we're not weighting any one indicator over the other here. Then the next step from there is then combining those different ecosystem level priorities and sort of connections within that ecosystem to an overall priority where you accommodate the multiple ecosystems coming together. So, it's in areas where you have a lot of high integrity co-occurring would be more important than areas where you just have those integrities sort of spread out across the map. So then the next step is pulling that together and moving to an overall priority layer. So here's an example using estuarine indicators, the beaches and dunes indicators, and also the maritime forest indicators. So we pulled all three together. In this case, the red areas are the higher integrity, the blue areas are lower integrity. And so again, these are just examples. We still have lots of experimenting around with some of the different parameters and connectivity and various other pieces. But just to give you a visual of how these things are going to start coming together. And this is the scale at which Blueprint 2.0 is going to be. So it's going to be at 200 meter pixels. We found in working with the different indicators and the different ecosystems that some of these data sets, it's a little hard to justify moving them to a smaller pixel than 200 meters just because of some of the coarseness of information. It's kind of like you wouldn't trust the 30 meter pixel of an LCD to be exactly right. But if you had a wider area, it's a little more doable. So 200 meters seemed accommodated the sort of some of the coarseness of the data. However, if you tried to make it any bigger, and it's still fairly fine resolution, if you try to make it any bigger, you start losing the resolution of the ecosystem. So of course you have things like, your maritime forest co-occurring with, being up against your salt marshes and being near your beaches. And so if you try to make a pixel any bigger, essentially you start losing the ecosystems themselves. So we couldn't really go anything bigger than 200 meters. So this will give you a visual of at least that pixel size we're working with. So you see, like I said, that some of the higher integrity areas here. And so I want to then, so here it is in the bigger area, but then all of this is based on the indicators themselves. So if we go back, and I'll grab sort of one of these patches as an example. So if we look at this patch that right here, that's a little above Amelia Island here, I'm going to pull up one of the indicators out of the estuarine. So this is on the Conservation Planning Atlas that I sort of pulled up an example. So one of those indicators was estuarine patch size index. This is actually one that drives a lot of the bigger scale prioritization from the estuary side. And so you'll see up above Cumberland Island, this section of particularly large sort of salt marsh patches here, large wetland patch here, which then if you look at the bottom right, you can also see how that influenced the higher sort of red in that particular area versus as you go lower to some of the other sections more close to St. Mary's, you see lower values and less of that red. So for each of these individual pieces, just like I showed before with the biodiversity hotspots graph, we can go in and then show for each of these, okay, here are the implications for the different indicators, and here's why each of those kind of red spots are red and things like that. So right now, So this is just ignoring the future threats right now. So this is current condition. Forget about sea level rise, urban growth, change. Let's get a snapshot of the integrity, where it's at right now. So that's what that piece is doing. Now we want to move on to bringing in the threats themselves. So in the main ones for Blueprint 2.0 are going to be sea level rise and urbanization. So of course, I'll live in this area, you know, that those are some of the huge impacts, sort of growing urban communities and sea level rise. So now on to depicting the sea level rise impacts themselves. And for the sea level rise model for this time around, we're going to be using the NOAA sea level rise model. And actually, if I notice, let me triple check. I think that was coming on here. Yeah, so Bethany's on the phone, which is very excellent. So who's been really closely involved in developing this sea level rise model for pretty much the entire Southeast, or nationally, I think. And she's been involved in some of these discussions, so that's great. So if I screw things up, Bethany, anytime during this, you can be like, Rua, what are you talking about? You're crazy. This is really exciting. Now we have, thanks to that effort, we now have seamless LiDAR across the entire coast, and then use that to develop some improved sea level rise models. So based on LiDAR, way better than the DEMs we had to work with on previous sea level rise models. And so it's bringing in two major elements to sea level rise, that open water conversion, your sort of marsh to open water conversion, so the one side of the impact, and then also bringing in the marsh migration. So we'll be using that for both the open water conversion and the marsh migration key for Blueprint 2. All right, we ran out of a little bit of time on showing some of the overlays, but just to give you some examples of in this same area. So we're back in that Georgia-Florida border here, looking at where the impacts are. So this is sort of current mean high water with the marshes, and then marsh change as we're moving into the future. So we have some pretty detailed predictions of where the marsh is going to change, where it isn't necessarily predicted to change very much, and also your overall changes to open water, which I think I'm missing that slide in the open water, so apologies for that. So we'll be using that to actually look at these areas of areas where we're potentially going to be seeing major bits of change, and you have higher integrity spots. Where are we losing if we don't do something? What are we gaining? And areas that seem like they're going to be relatively stable out into the future. So on to the sea level rise scenarios. So this is, a particularly important piece. We just had a discussion on this in one of the design team calls, and it was actually really excellent discussion about what are some sort of plausible by 2050 sea level rise rates that we might run into based on some different kind of actions we might take. So kind of what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, particularly around, purely looking at sort of the rise of the sea level itself, but also considering scenarios of, looking at accretion and what's our sort of best and worst case scenarios for accretion. So we have a set now of different scenarios that seem relatively that seem plausibly bound for the South Atlantic. We had a lot of really good discussion, particularly about changes in sediment coming down the major rivers, and what kind of accretion do we actually expect in this area. So we have a set of scenarios, and talk about real quick how that's going to feed in. So you have your threats, right? You have your sea level rise and urbanization, but then there's the key question of, okay, what are you going to do about it? Because there are some different, we do a lot of things like, living shorelines, hydrologic restorations, things to develop, improve the resilience of the system. So that's one way we respond to sea level rise, actually moving towards the challenge, and then also just kind of fleeing the coast. And one thing that came up really heavily in the last Blueprint workshops was this core question about how do we deal with the threats, urban growth and sea level rise into the future, and how much effort do we spend basically fleeing from them, get as far away from them as possible, run from the coast with certain types of conservation actions, particularly things like long-term land water protection. That makes sense. But what about, helping to actually deal with migration, marsh migration inland, and, water management, education, and other conservation actions, incentives we may want to do near some of the threats. That was a big point of discussion, but we never really got to have a structured way of discussing it. And so a big part of this next version of the blueprint is going to be looking at some different strategies of how we could deal with these threats and looking at the different trade-offs amongst indicators. So you got your threat coming out, and then we'll have some multiple strategies. So one will be based on Blueprint 1. So this is an update on Blueprint version 1. We'll be looking at Blueprint version 1 as looking at what that could have gotten us from indicators and what that means. And the other two we're going to be trying to depict is essentially what if we spend a little more time fleeing the threats? So this kind of thing would be moving farther away, not doing as much work in the coast, even though they're high integrity places, moving more inland, moving away from urban communities, and one that involves more confronting the threat. So one that's like, okay, well, what if we spend a little more of our effort trying to build resilience into the coastal ecosystem and tried to reduce the impacts where they're coming. So the way to look at that, so here's a sort of a simplified strategy 1, strategy 3. So they avoid the threats versus to confront the threats. And so the way this is going to work, interplaying with these different scenarios, or the way we're thinking about doing it right now, is if you have let's say you're avoid the threats. We spend less time away from the coast. You don't try to work on sort of building resilience in there. You just sort of flee. Then you're going to have you'd be experiencing your sort of highest scenario, your worst impacts as your more bounded worst case scenario. So that's you're going to get the worst of the worst. Okay, now if we're avoiding threats, things may actually work out better than we think. So we may actually get the medium scenario. So here's our sort of a bounding for if we flee from sea level rise. And then, so the confront the threats is a little bit different now. So if we're actually working actively, on sort of trying to build up the resilience of the system, trying to deal more naturally with sea level rise and its impact, we'd likely have more of the medium scenario as the worst case and a lower sea level rise scenario. So in that case, we may be able to build up more accretion of the system through some management and some other options. And so this is, really trying to bring in the actions and the things we do as a conservation community and feed it back into these threats we're facing. Usually when you do conservation planning, you sort of pretend like, your actions don't really have any impact on the threats and it just happens no matter what. So this is taking that to the next level and looking at some of the trade-offs of working across these places. Okay, so that's a little bit about the feedback into those threats. And so what we'll be able to do, since we have these different indicators and specific measures of each, is we'll be able to present looking at these different strategies, avoiding threats more, confronting threats more in some of these places in the coast, and be able to present the trade-off. To look, okay, well, what does that mean for the overall integrity, both, for each ecosystem? What are the winners? What are the losers? What does that mean? And even for the indicators within the ecosystem. And so what's going to be coming up in the beginning of next year is a series of workshops. So similar in kind of timing, that sort of 5-hour, one-day workshop like we did before in Blueprint 1. But in this case, we're going to be really looking at focusing in on these kind of core strategies and the trade-offs. So you'll have all the different trade-offs of the indicators and across these different strategies, we'll have the big map. You'll be able to sort of look at the differences in what one might mean in the other. And the outcome of this is actually going to be a weighting of these different strategies and a decision, based on the indicators and the trade-offs of, how much effort we as a conservation community want to put collectively towards some of these different strategies. Doesn't mean that everyone has to do every single piece, but collectively, when we all come together, how much and who's going to take which pieces of that. So those are going to be some really fun workshops. We'll be able to dive into a lot of the data and trade-offs. And so from there, that's going to get us to Blueprint 2. So Blueprint 2, we're shooting for having the draft by April. And with that, I want to hit on the workshops for all of you. So basically, if you're within the South Atlantic LCC boundaries, every one of these locations ought to be within like around 2 hours or less driving. So we've set these all up so they would be basically no cost for people, other than maybe lunch or gas, to get to these different locations. And there's not going to be any registration fee or anything like that. So we're going to be setting up these workshops. They'll be 10 to 3, so you can leave at a staying hour, get back at a staying hour. Every single one of these workshops is going to be, pretty much identical. There's no reason to go to more than one. But this time we've doubled the number of workshops. So, folks, if you're in the Panhandle of Florida, all right, we got one in Tallahassee. If you're up in Atlanta, you're far from the last workshops, we got one in Atlanta. So trying to get a good spread here across the geography, so everyone would have something that's within a few hours drive. And in these, that's what we're really going to be getting together in groups and talking strategy and looking at trade-offs, and should be really, really fun. And with that, I will just leave up those workshops. So we don't have, other than the Raleigh ones, we don't have locations set up just yet. Just wanted to get them on your calendars. And with that, I will leave that up and take any questions.
Thanks, Rua. Just a reminder to press *6 to unmute or type into the chat box if you want to ask a question.
I think Doug Newcomb has his hand raised. Do you have a question, Doug? You can hit *6 to unmute, or if you type it in the chat box.
Hey, Rua, this is Patrick Curris. Can I ask a question?
Hey, you bet you can.
Yeah, I was wondering, I've seen some projects comparing zonation results and mark plan results, and sometimes they're quite similar and sometimes quite different. So I was just wondering if you've done any comparison like that.
Yeah, we haven't done a ton of comparison yet, as we're just building up. I think we just finished finalizing indicators from a few of the different models. There are some differences in how some of the algorithm works in some of the pieces. I think we will probably do a little bit of comparisons just to see how robust the actual, are we getting something that looks fairly similar, when the playing field is equal. I mean, there's some things that Marksan doesn't have, from what I understand, on some of the directional connectivity in freshwater systems and some of the other pieces. But I think we'll take a look as we get a fuller set of ecosystems to just sort of see how different some of the runs are. But the real sinking point was the simulated annealing part of Marksan, and just sort of I get it, but it's a little harder to explain to other folks.
Sure. And just follow up, are you running each of your indicators as a target versus just trying to capture representation of the ecosystems themselves?
So we're actually doing, so it's all sort of full maximizing the utility of everything. So we do 2 optimization runs. So we can treat the ecosystems within ecosystems differently than the cross-ecosystem issues. So this comes in things like if you think about some particularly important for things like when you have a system like a beach where it's a very linear system, and so a boundary length penalty and form is a little different for a beach than for, say, your open pine system. So we optimize the indicators within ecosystem first and then across ecosystem. And it's not, the good thing is it's not too, because each ecosystem inherits the landscape indicators, so it gets the climate resilient hotspots, it gets the low road areas, it gets some indicators that are also sort of a broader cross ecosystem. Then, even though it's optimizing within each ecosystem, it also is considering the larger landscape context. But yeah, we do it within the system and we do it across, but it's not a target-based measure. So it's purely just sort of trying to maximize across all of them weighted equally. Does that get what you're asking?
I sort of got that, but yeah, probably need to read something. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. But yeah, we can follow up later if you want. I could give you a little more details. It's been a while since I've worked in Marksan too, so yeah, I'm trying to remember the immediate translation back and forth between the latest ones.
All right, thanks.
Hey, Rua, you seeing questions from Doug Newcomb in the chat box? He's asking, what resolution is the NOAA sea level rise model? Will the model be updated with the new North Carolina LiDAR data coming in January?
So I will actually, if you're still on there, Bethany, I will punt will the model be updated with the new North Carolina LiDAR coming in January to you to see where that might be at. That's all good. And it's *6 to unmute.
Now it works.
All right. Oh, I think we might have lost Bethany.
Well,
yeah, maybe so.
This is Doug. It actually took 2 instances of *6 to get the unmute.
Wow, double *6.
Yeah.
It was really muting you. So I don't know. Well, if we get Bethany back, she might be able to answer about whether it's bringing the new North Carolina LiDAR data. If it's coming in January, I think that would be cutting it pretty close. So I don't know how fast they can turn that around and how fast we'd be able to, if we'd have to have it probably ready by January to be able to include in the blueprint workshops anyways. The new models. So my guess is probably not for this round, unless things move very fast for getting it incorporated in the blueprint. I'm not sure how soon it would be coming into the NOAA sea level rise model.
Well, the concern is that the vertical accuracy on the LiDAR data for North Carolina was 9 inches. The new data coming in, I think, is somewhere around 3 inches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a significant resolution collection update.
Oh yeah, it'll be much better. That'll be exciting. Yeah. So if it hits in time that we can fold it in, yeah, definitely. If not, it'll just have to be for the next revision there. Okay. So just got a chat from Bethany. It's on there to everyone. So she's going to check on the sea level rise viewer and when it's going to be updated. So their plan to do that, just not sure how quickly it's going to happen. So it sounds like if all the stars align, we may have it all folded in, and we'll find out when that's going to be updated with the new North Carolina data. So we'll see.
I probably should try to talk to Bethany offline about that.
Yeah, that'll work. And then the blueprint resolution, 200 meters, the spatial constraint that makes the cells that size. The reason, so I think I mentioned the higher, as we get a little bit bigger, we start losing resolution of the ecosystems themselves. So we have ecosystems masks for your sort of forested wetland, for your pine, woodland, savanna, and prairie. And so at least on the upper bound of making it bigger, we started losing resolution, and the forested wetlands started getting swallowed by the pine or vice versa. And so same thing with maritime forest. that didn't make sense. And then on the smaller side, you know, a lot of these data, it's kind of like NLCD, where, you know, it's a little hard to justify. You wouldn't want to bet the farm on exactly whether that 30-meter pixel was right. And so on a few of these particular, like for example, the urban growth is at 90 meters. It's not at 30-meter pixel. And we're working with sometimes up 12 level summaries. And so at that point, it's kind of hard to justify driving down to, you know, 100-meter pixels or smaller. And then also, yeah, so that was really on the getting it too small. You ended up having a number of coarse data, and it would just give a false sense of accuracy. And it also would make the optimization runs in zonation take a lot longer too. So that's how we got to the sweet spot. And also for everyone that hasn't been checking, it looks like Bethany had said some other another chat box about how, you know, saying it's critical to get that in, and she can request it being expedited. She said it would help if the South Atlantic LCC could send an email making that particular request. So as staff of your cooperative, you know, that's I can go ahead and make that request to see if we can get that expedited and get that better data into the viewer and the information and in time, and see if we can get it hit for Blueprint too. Yay. Thanks, Bethany.
We have another question from John Kaufman in the chat box. He asks, you talked about increasing resilience. Can you give some examples of how you would do that, for example, in a salt marsh?
Yeah, well, so for some of the cases, you know, a lot of these systems are a little bit connected. So if you look at salt marsh accretion, and particularly in some of the hydrologic restorations, actually the immediate thing that comes to mind from a simple dealing with sea level rise, I think about the more in that sort of forested wetland Pocosin sort of open system, where you think about restoring the hydrology in your Pocosin systems, you know, re-wetting the peat turns it from basically a carbon source to a carbon sink, and you start actually getting accretion. And so that's one of our bigger hits of what's going to get impacted by sea level rise, you know, out on some of those organic soiled forested wetlands in the Pocosin. So then you've got some, you can actually sort of start building up the accretion level and build up some more resilience in that. Salt marsh, there are some other things related to freshwater inflows, and also things like improving aquatic connectivity to help improve sort of sedimentation load. So there are a few different strategies and pieces that I think we'll also be talking about a little bit more at the workshop as well, and some of these strategies. Did that help, John?
Yes, it did.
Cool.
Yes, it did. I think I'm off mute.
Yeah, yep, you are.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
I know. I can't tell you how many times I sit here and talk forever, ask a question, and I'm like, oh yeah, mute. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, or comments from folks on the call? These are really good, excellent questions and discussion points.
All right. Well, thanks for the great discussion. I'm going to reclaim the presenter power here and just give some South Atlantic LCC staff updates. So I wanted to just reiterate, you guys have heard this before if you've been on this web forum, that my colleague Louise Vaughn and I are here to support people who are using the blueprint, and our doors are really open for anyone who has questions about how to use it. They want to share feedback with the South Atlantic staff, or wants to just share their experience using the blueprint, what they liked, what they didn't like. We're here. This is our contact information, and we would love to hear from you. I'll just give a quick sneak peek of next month's Third Thursday Web Forum. It'll take place November 20th, same time, same place. We'll be hearing from Monica Dorning, who's a postdoc researcher with the Center for Geospatial Analysis at NC State University. and she's going to be discussing the development and implementation of the Smart Sleuth Modeling Framework, which is an open source software package that augments the functionality of Sleuth by including explicit representations of landscape patterns, human decisions, and smart growth policies. So Smart Sleuth can be used to analyze and visualize the impacts of different smart growth scenarios on the landscape. And this is something we may be pulling into Blueprint 2.0.
Yep. So two quick shout outs, one for what you just said, Hillary. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, that we may be able to incorporate the new sort of smart sleuth modeling into the urban growth to depict a sort of, if we spend more effort working in your urban communities, actually more formally incorporating compact development scenarios into the sort of future change models. And the other thing that I forgot to mention on a shout out is that you notice in that example for the estuarine, there's the waterscape system, which is all about the connections between the fresh and the ocean. And there is a ecosystem revision team that's going to be working on waterscapes. And it's scheduled to start in December, but we're going to start that a little bit early. So if anyone, if you haven't already signed up for being part of those discussions for the waterscape, if you'd like to be part of it, please either sign up through the sort of link on the website under indicators, or you can just send me an email and then just let me know, and I can pull that in, because we're going to be talking about two really exciting things. So one thing we're going to be talking about, translating the aquatic connectivity work that TNC has been doing as part of the Southeast Aquatic Connectivity Assessment Project into an indicator of aquatic connectivity, probably actually two indicators of aquatic connectivity. So we've got some good progress on that. And also we're going to be talking about depicting the index of flow alteration for the South Atlantic, and we will have the flow models from RTI ready in time to depict those for Blueprint 2. So we'll be able to pick 3 to 5 flow alteration metrics that we want to combine together in a single index of flow alteration. So we will have baseline, altered, and future flow predictions for every catchment in the South Atlantic LCC as part of that effort. So just a quick plug. I'm hoping to start just getting some folks together on a call to start talking about the flow alteration and the connectivity stuff probably this month. So if you haven't already signed up and you want to be part of that discussion, you can sign up on the indicator page or just send me an email.
All right. That's actually a perfect segue, Rua, because we like to end on making sure folks know how they can get involved in your cooperative. So joining an indicator review team is definitely a fabulous way to do that and share your expertise. So in addition to doing that, you can contact your staff, a steering committee representative. The South Atlantic LCC also posts updates and events on its website, and that's also where you can learn about upcoming projects, access spatial data, and the conservation blueprint. And in addition, joining our web community gives you access to our monthly newsletter, which is basically a summary of conservation news and updates on your cooperative's activities, as well as a reminder about this monthly web forum. So with that, I will open the floor back up for any additional questions folks might have before we sign off. Just remember *6. All right, sounds like cricket. So it is 10:47. We are 13 minutes ahead of schedule. But that's it from the staff of your cooperative. So thanks, Rua, for presenting, and thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll hope you join us again next month.
Bye, everyone.